Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the GRIPS Forum. My name is Narushige Michita. I teach International Security Affairs at this National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Tokyo. I'll be serving as your host today. India is growing rapidly. In 2022, India was the fifth largest economy in the world and the fourth largest spender on defense in the world. India has the world's largest population of 1.4 billion, and the country's economic growth rate is in the 2022 to 2023 period was 7.2%, the second highest of the G20 countries. The relationship between India and Japan remains strong. India is one of the small number of countries with which Japan organizes so-called 2+2 or foreign and defense ministerial meetings. India and Japan are members of the Quad, together with the United States and Australia. The two countries share democratic values, and they have agreed to promote free and open Indo-Pacific. Yet, there are important differences between the two countries. While Japan maintains a strong alliance relationship with the United States, India strictly adjures military alliances. While Japan is a non-nuclear weapon state, India is the seventh largest nuclear weapon state, armed with about 100 nuclear devices. How is India dealing with the world with a number of challenges, and how will the relationship between India and Japan develop? Today, we have invited Ambassador Nirupama Rao, a former Indian Foreign Secretary, to answer those questions. Ambassador Rao served as the Foreign Ministry's spokesperson, High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and the People's Republic of China, and Ambassador to the United States. Since Ambassador Rao retired from her government duties, she has taught at Brown and Columbia universities. In 2021, she published a book entitled The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China from 1949 to 1962. I will ask Ambassador Rao to speak for about 35 minutes, and we will invite GRIPS faculty and students to offer comments and ask questions, and then open the floor for Q&A and discussion after that. The presentation and discussion in this session will be on the record. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Rao.
Namaste. Good afternoon to the audience present here today. President Ota, Executive Vice President Michishita, Ambassador Imura, who is an old friend, Ambassador Watanabe, distinguished members of the faculty, and dear students. I've been asked to speak about India in the world today. It's a very big topic. India, as you know, is a country of continental proportions, and the usual definitions defy India. But India today is a country that is prepared to assume big responsibility and even bigger ambition. India is trying to catalyze, really speaking, a new mindset within humanity. Beyond the polarization, the conflict, if I may say, the greed and the confrontation that one witnesses across our planet today, it is trying, this is always an endeavor, as we know, a sense of oneness. What our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, calls the spirit of one earth, one family, one future. The term often used by government spokespersons is, and I'll say it in Sanskrit and explain it to you, Vishwamitra, which translates into friend of the world. India's priorities, which are largely shared across the global south, are climate change, countering terrorism, and fighting threats to our health security, and the recent COVID pandemic is a vivid illustration of that. And these are issues that can be solved only by acting together and not fighting with each other. All this takes place against the background of the fierce rivalries and the conflict which we see in the world today. The war in the Ukraine, the terrible conflict that we see in Gaza, the rivalry between China and the United States, and in your own neighborhood, in our neighborhood, I would say, neighborhoods are so linked in today's world, the simmering tensions over Taiwan. India's worldview today is never myopic. It sees the world as interconnected, not compartmentalized between North and South, because trade, because migration, because technology, because the digital space, they all weave complex linkages between countries and peoples. India wants to do business with everybody. And this perspective is shared by our friends in the developing world. We are concerned about the vulnerability of our peoples to conflict and to division, strife, and the threats that these pose to our security and our development, to the health of our peoples, to building more access to education, to the constant dangers of climate vulnerability, occupational mobility, and therefore, we are against the weaponizing of interdependence. We stand for healthy multilateralism, and we want to be a bridging presence. Throughout our history, And history is so important to each and every one of us. The history that is imprinted in our DNA, that we have experienced as nations and as peoples. Throughout our history, we have steered clear of entrapment in others' wars. I know that many in the West would like us to take sides, and they call India's stance as studied neutrality, or what you will. But India will not be moved except if we determine it is in our interest to shift position. We are, of course, sensitive and intensely nationalistic, may I add today. The country rallies around criticisms about our democracy because the rules on how we are perceived are half-baked at best. No society, no polity is perfect. And as I have said before, and I quote from what I've written in the past, the road to global leadership is open for India, since credentials for a seat at the high table of world power are basically founded on military and economic strength, buttressed by civilizational and cultural values and attributes, which India possesses in abundance, as you know. All of this is in India's grasp and mark its rise, unquote. In our view, resurgent nationalism, as you see in India today, and democracy can coexist without contradiction. India sees itself as an independent pole of global power. And it seeks, as you saw during the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi, that was a strong manifestation of India's effort to seek consensus between polarized divides in the world. For instance, you saw that in the language and the phraseology on the Ukraine in the outcome document of the summit. What do countries like India, who see themselves as representing the global South today, want? They do not want a debt crisis. They do not want a climate crisis. They do not want an energy crisis. And they do not want a food crisis. And the memories of the pandemic are very graphically still with us. We don't want a crisis that entails access, the lack of access to medicines and vaccines. We want trusted and resilient global supply chains. We want fundamental reforms to global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations, so that these institutions better represent the global South. We want financial inclusion for our poor, millions of them, access to the digital marketplace and the digital public square, the peaceful utilization of space technologies for better lives, especially for our rural population, for our women, because gender-focused development is crucially important for the rise of our societies and indeed increase in our GDPs. Another area is disaster-resilient infrastructure. And as a country, India wishes to share and is sharing our development experience through development partnerships with fellow Global South countries. We are realists and pragmatists in the operation of our foreign policy. Indeed, you could describe this approach as disciplined pragmatism and an attitude of reasonable compromise. We do not claim to be conscience keepers of the world. Take our policy on Russia. Now, we have deep-rooted ties with that country. You may all know that roughly, and this is just a rough figure, 60% of our weapons and our defense systems are sourced from Russia. It's a legacy relationship. In the aftermath of the Ukraine war and Western attempts to isolate Russia through unilateral sanctions, that, may I add, had no UN mandate, Russia became a source of cheap energy for India, which literally meant huge benefits for our economy and our people. And we felt that we had every legitimate right to avail of such supplies, because ultimately, in the ultimate analysis, it's the will of the people that count in a democracy, not the arbitrage or the arbiter attitude of countries outside our borders. Secondly, as China and Russia grow even closer, we see no reason to give up our equities vis-a-vis Moscow, nurtured through the years of investment in an India-Russia relationship, because we see no reason to push Moscow further into China's embrace, because it has nowhere to turn to. And even as the West criticizes Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, the West has been similarly guilty on many fronts in the past, whether in Libya, whether in Iraq, you can say Afghanistan. So memories are notoriously short when it comes to the workings of geopolitics and the clash of ideology and power centers, and no single rule seems to apply. Today, of course, the power differential favors China in the Russia-China pairing. And the divisions between Russia and the West have provided a golden opportunity for China. Now, I'd like to also refer to our relationship with the United States. Now, this is a key partnership for India today. It's a solid, substantial, and extremely well-sustained relationship. And I think in many ways the United States has come to understand, and I think it's been a long and tortuous path to arrive at that kind of realization, enlightenment, you could say, that cooperation, India's attitude is built on strengthening cooperation India has never sought dominance in its region. It seeks connectivity, not isolation. It respects the global commons. Its approach is inclusive and not exclusive. And it has always stressed in its own behavior adherence to global rules and norms. The United States is today our largest export destination. We have extremely close ties in technology and now in critical and emerging technologies. There is a dialogue across many levels in this relationship. It involves our leaders, it involves high officials, it involves captains of finance and industry. I mentioned trade. To that I'll add clean energy, homeland security, and of course, the larger theater of the Indo-Pacific, the confluence of the two seas, as late Mr. Shinzo Abe called it in an address to our parliament in 2007. This is a theater of convergence for democracies such as ours. And the Quad, which the Executive Vice President just mentioned, of India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, is an example of this steadily expanding, organically coherent, and cohesive structure that we seek to build in the Indo-Pacific as a very steady, balancing trend. But coming back to the bilateral relationship between India and the United States, just as an example, in the field of business, it may interest you to know that India, as you know, which is a giant in the field of information technology, our IT industry supports 1.6 million jobs in the United States. It has an output of $96 billion a year, and it has added 198 billion US dollars of output to the American GDP, which is larger than half of many US state economies. Now, the Indo-Pacific is a theater of great and crucial importance to each and every one of us in this audience today. And the Quad, which, as you know, took off in the wake of the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 and had a very short-lived existence up to 2007, when somehow it kind of faded away, only to be revived in 2017, is today, as I just mentioned, acquiring more and more coherence and a clear center of gravity when it comes to maritime domain awareness, when it comes to training and skill development, climate change and mitigation. We have the STEM fellowships, the Quad STEM fellowships, of which you are aware. There is an area of active cooperation in health security, supply chain resilience, cyber security, critical infrastructure, and space. And I think it takes strength, the Quad, from this great convergence of the democratic spirit and the assertion of a rules-based international order based on democratic norms and fundamental freedoms. With the United States itself, India's defense, trade, and technology has taken off in a manner that could have hardly been imagined at the turn of the century. And you look at I spoke of the defense connections between India and Russia. But in many ways, I think these are, in a sense, handed down from relationships that had certain past priorities. But in today's world, I believe, this defense relationship between India and the United States is now extending into research and development, co-production, co-development, co-manufacturing. And the Indian Air Force, the heavy lift capabilities of the Indian Air Force have been significantly augmented by the purchase of American aircraft, large-bodied aircraft like the P-8Is, the C-17s, the C-130Js, and the helicopter lift capacity, which includes Chinooks, Apaches, and of course, for the ground army, weapons and weapon systems. Recently, an agreement was reached during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US a few months ago for the development of GE F414 engines for our light combat aircraft, which I think is an extremely significant development and marks a new stage in our defense cooperation. There are increasing arrays of exercises involving all three forces of our defense establishment. We're building habits of cooperation and interoperability. And importantly, cooperation during crises that we have faced. In 2017, during the standoff with China in the Doklam Plateau in Bhutan. In 2019, during a standoff with Pakistan. 2020, when we had the confrontation between Indian and Chinese forces in eastern Ladakh on our northern frontiers. During COVID, of course. And of course, there is this whole bridge of people-to-people relations that we are building with the United States. There are about 200,000 Indian students who are now based in the United States who are studying, 76% of them in STEM subjects, which speaks of the importance of this skill development for the future of both countries. Trade, which today has amounted to 191 billion US dollars. And there is, of course, the dimension of the Indian diaspora, 2.8 million Indian Americans and about 1.5 million non-American citizens, Indian nationals, who live and work in the United States. So this is a collective investment by leaders of both countries in the relationship. And there is a breadth of issues and structures that define this relationship today. And even deep differences are addressed and discussed with honesty and candor. Between friends, as they say, there can be really no barriers. And in both our countries, I think this foreign policy of ours is a foreign policy for the middle classes. Ideological hesitations have been largely shed. There is no US activism you see today on India-Pakistan issues or on the issue of Kashmir. There is a convergence of interest in stabilizing the Asian balance of power and a collaboration on global challenges. I know occasionally all of us see this and we experience it. There is American evangelism on democracy and human rights. But I think realpolitik prevails ultimately. And, you've seen this happen in the case of America's relations with many countries in the past. I think realpolitik wins the day. I don't need to go into examples. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. When it comes to Southeast Asia, and I think that's a region of importance to both Japan and to India, this is, again, relationships that we have forged with a very strong people content through migration, through trade and business, through education, through shared values. And I know the whole question of China's rise is viewed through different prisms by all of us. But as has been said by our strategic experts, and I refer to Indian strategic experts, we can't really frame a moral equivalence between US and Chinese actions in the region. And I think thereby hangs the tale. This could probably be discussed at length. I don't want to take too much of your time on this. But let me say that India tries to pursue a free and energetic foreign policy. I know that terms like strategic autonomy, multi-alignment, respect for multipolarity, all that tends to come into play. Some say we've moved from non-aligned to non-allied. We are not in the business of entering into alliances. But even the word alliance, I believe, acquires new definitions. It's not really the post-World War II definition that we can strictly apply to alliances today. Maybe the favored architecture of approach is really something that, yes, in a way is strategic autonomy, but stems, I believe, from the uniqueness of India's geography. It's a geography of continental proportions, our peninsular region abutting 2 seas and an ocean, our northern region, which borders the fastnesses of Central Asia, our western regions facing West Asia, and our northeast, with which Japan is very closely involved when it comes to development assistance, is a gateway to Southeast Asia. And of course, it connects, the eastern part of India through Bangladesh. Therefore, Bangladesh is so important for us as a neighbor, apart from the other traditions that we share. So all in all, India's significant geopolitical, economic, commercial interests predicate our approach in foreign policy and our desire to reach across various ideologies, across hemispheres, across borders, to craft a foreign policy for our people that is aligned to their interests. So India is basically, as we've said before, neither with East nor with West. It is essentially on India's side, on our own side. So in many ways, I believe India is a hub country. It is in some ways porous, it is permeable. It has weathered conquest, it has weathered assimilation. It is in many ways the place of every arrival. I don't want to stop before speaking a little about our relationship with China. I think today, this is a very complex relationship. As you know, you're probably aware that India and China share a border which is close to 3,500 kilometers long. So we are, neighbors. We share a land border. And for many years, India and China worked, I think, to build a modus vivendi after the War of 1962. I think there was effort exerted by both sides to build a management regime, as it were, in the relationship, even if the problem of contested borders had not been solved. And this was not a sign of weakness in my view. I think it gave India time to focus on its own internal development priorities, its economic reform process, the betterment of the lives of our people. But it was not a structure that was resilient enough to weather the storms of growing confrontation, growing assertiveness, particularly as China rose in military and economic power. There was China's relationship with Pakistan, of course, that was a thorn in the flesh. And the trust deficit between the two countries grew, did not diminish. And I think that on one side at least, and you will guess who I'm talking of, on one side at least, there was contempt for the larger picture, the larger global picture for both countries to cooperate in order to strengthen multilateralism. China has been opposed essentially to UN Security Council reform, to the possibility of India's becoming a permanent member, India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group, and of course on the issue of terrorism, we've had serious differences with the Chinese when it comes to strengthening work within the United Nations to counter global terror groups, particularly those based out of Pakistan. Our own relationship with Japan, in many ways, I think, is a picture-perfect relationship. It stands in vivid contrast to our relationship with, the difficult neighborhood relationships that I spoke of just now. I think Japan is a much-loved country in India, has always been. And it's a history of friendship and shared interests and values that goes back to the aftermath of the Second World War. And I think especially in the last decade, the extent of deepening relationship between our two countries across the board, whether it's political understanding, whether it's shared definitions of the emergent situation in the Indo-Pacific, trade and investment, transfer of technology, Indian students who come to Japan, young Indian professionals who work here. Yesterday, when I flew on my flight from Bangalore to Tokyo, a direct flight, the flight was full of young Indian professionals, obviously, who work in Tokyo who were taking the flight back from Bangalore. So the interconnectivity, the close identification of common interest, I think binds us together and makes this relationship a very special partnership, which India greatly values. And in a sense, we are two bookends, literally, of the Indo-Pacific, you in the East and we in the West. And our defense and security relationship, again, has acquired a very, very important dimension as a result of all the factors that I spoke of. I think for both our countries, our approach to the rise of China, I don't believe it is to contain China so much as to manage the rise of China in a way that doesn't detract from our shared security interests, the welfare of our people, and to peace and tranquility within this neighborhood. Neither of us would like conflict and war, but we would like a management of tension and the reduction of threat, the safety of sea lines of communication, the passage of trade and people, and essentially for the Indo-Pacific to be what it has been through history, a sea really of tranquility, of commerce, of contact, a human sea, as it were. I think I've spoken, perhaps overshot the time allotted to me, so I will stop here. I've tried to speak a little of the fact that countries such as ours seek to be cosmopolitan, seek to be integrative, seek to be inclusive in our approach, and balance both traditional and non-traditional interests in how we view the world. And I think for India today, as this debate goes on within the country about our new resurgence, if you come to India today, you see a vitality, you see a resurgence, you see an optimism and literally an outpouring of newfound, in many ways, optimism and confidence about the future of the country. In many ways, this is an India, as our government often says, that is more Bharat. And Bharat is, as you know, the traditional name for India. The opening words in our constitution refer to it also. So I think we're all witness in many ways to very historic developments in India today. It is a country, the world's largest democracy, as you know, the world's largest country in terms of population. You referred to the size of our economy, the fact that we are poised to become a $5 trillion economy in the next 1 or 2 years, I would say. The government has set a target for us attaining developed country status by 2047, when we complete a centenary of our independence. So great things are dreamt for India today, and there is a sense, a can-do sense that infuses, I believe, our young demographic. You know, about 65% of the country is at the median age of 27. It's a very, very young country, and therefore full of energy, brimming with energy, I would say. So you can count on India. I think you can rest assured that this is a country that is going places. Thank you.